Hello, 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 everyone. Hi. Oh, okay. Beginning of the stream, and what you're going to see is a lot of me not prepared. That's that. So, if you're watching, I'm totally not prepared right now, um, because this is actually a very crazy week, but I didn't want to skip our session because I love doing our sessions so much, but unfortunately it is a hard week to do this. So if by the way, if you're new around here, hello, I am Tigria. I'm trying to look down as I'm kind of grabbing everything. Hi everyone. I am Tigria Gardenia. I'm a nature inspired mentor and a certified life coach, and I am a world ambassador for plant intelligence. And, I'll give you a bunch of other good stuff in a minute as I'm trying desperately to get everything. That wasn't what I wanted. I wanted this. See? Hi. That's who I am. It's down in the ticker on the bottom. So the reason I'm not completely, because that's not true. I have a long thing of preparation. I'm just caught a little off guard right now because this is the week of the commemoration of the dead, which is a very important ritual here in Damanhur. So this is a ritual that one of what we call the 5 great rituals in Damanhur. And the 5 great rituals are the rituals that we do 5 times a year, obviously, in order to, hey, where'd that go? Sorry, I was just like downloading. There it is. The 5 great rituals are the 2 solstices, the 2 equinoxes, and the commemoration of the dead. And obviously the commemoration of the dead, as you can imagine, is all about commemorating the dead. And so this is a moment. Why do you do this? I was trying to open the paper that I'm going to do today. The commemoration of the dead is a very important ritual for us because it is the ritual where we connect with all of our ancestors and we honor the dead in general. Oh my goodness, stop, go away. It's giving me like my PDF thing is giving me all kinds of strange, what do you want to do with this? It's like, I just want to open it so that I can actually see it correctly. But yeah, so the commemoration of the dead is a really important ritual, and we have a lot of different preparations that we do in order to get ready for the great rituals. So I've been running around like a chicken with my head cut off, trying to get all of these different preparations done. In addition to getting the preparations done, I just realized that this light, hold on a second. Give me 1 second. Okay. I know. Oops. Why did that not work? Hey, it's not doing what I want to do. Okay. It's not doing what I want to do. Okay. Give me 1 second. I will be just 1 second. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. I was resetting something because lights are going to get really tricky in a minute. So I was setting everything up. I'm still, the time changed in Europe last week. It'll change in the US over this weekend. And so I am just all confused with time and stuff like that. Anyways, I was saying the commemoration of the dead is a beautiful, beautiful ritual. Like I said, one of our 5 great rituals, like the solstices and the equinox. And we have a lot of preparations that we do in order to get ready for any of the great rituals. On top of that, I actually have some of my students here from around the world, from my students in the path of Medit Action, which is the initiatic path here at Damanhur. And so my co-teacher, instructor, and I have been with our students all over the place, getting them ready for the ritual, having different activities, teaching them things. So it's been a busy day. And so I got back from being with them today and had a client, and then just stuff. Look, just stuff. It's just been stuffs. So but I'm here now. I am so here. I have a paper ready for us, and I am actually really excited about this paper because it's another one of those interesting papers that when you'll see it when we get there. So this paper is from 2022. It's a paper by David Colaço. At least I think that's how I think you pronounce it, but I'm not 100% sure. And it's a paper that I've had on my list for quite a while. I have to redo my list because right now, according to my list, we're kind of at the tail end of 2022. There are some 2000 and whatever X papers that I've skipped because I just feel like they don't fit into the thing in this moment. They don't fit into the things that we're exactly looking at. So we're going to look at them at a later date. And I also have a whole series of other papers that I want to go through more carefully so I can reorder them because I think now that we're in the 2022's span, I'm going to cluster them slightly differently in order to give us more of an opportunity to follow certain threads. For example, right now, I have been going mostly chronological order, but there are some very technical papers that help us better understand what plant communication is and how plant communication works. And then there are other papers that instead are more connected to what's the word I'm looking for? They're more connected to plant consciousness, plant intelligence perspective. And then there's others that are all the part of the plant humanities. So up until now, the way that I've been going is sort of just chronological order, which means that we skip around. Now, naturally, there are some papers that then have a reply, that then have another paper and such like that. So we have had certain papers that have sort of clustered together in certain ways. But in general, we still follow kind of the more timeline flow rather than trying to follow the flow of what the papers themselves are talking about. I think now that we're getting into a period of time where there is much more of a flow of papers coming through all the time, I want to instead have a more just use a different approach. I want to try to use the approach of looking at the papers and clustering them around. Okay. So that being said, I'm going to shut off anything that might ping, ding, or, do any kind of weird soundy things that we just don't need right now. It's not important. I'm shutting it all off. That way I can dedicate myself to you, which is what I always want to do in this period of time. And then I'm going to share my papers. So let me prep that. Because like I said, I usually prep it beforehand. And I didn't have a chance to. But it's okay. How are you doing? How is your week? How was it? Whenever it is that you're seeing this, like, how's your day going? How is your week going? Okay. I know I feel really scattered right now. I should take like a second. Hold on. I'm going to drink some water. I didn't even have time to go fill my teacup. So, I didn't even give myself time to fill my teacup. So that was on me. And so here's the paper that we're going to talk about. This is why studying plant cognition is valuable, even if plants aren't cognitive. Now, as you know, I never read these papers beforehand. Unless there's some reason that I feel like it's really important. 99% of the time, I read them here with you. I read their titles. I might read who the author is. I might read about the author or something like that, but I didn't get into the heart of this. So I actually don't know whether or not this person is literally saying in this title, studying this stuff is important, even if we know that it doesn't apply to plants, or if this person is saying, studying this stuff is valuable, and I don't know if it applies to plants, but even if it weren't to apply to plants, then it's okay. And you have to remember that around the time that this paper comes out, so again, this is about the tail end of 2022. There are now, by this point, a much more prolific amount of general papers going through the mainstream. So there's articles coming out in the New York Times. There's articles that are coming out. We've done a few different articles that come out in different publications. There's a number of different books that have come out by this point, from Thus Spoke the Plant by Monica Galliano to, I believe, Susan Simard's kind of autobiography comes out, Finding the Mother Tree. We had Peter Willebin's the Hidden Life of Trees. we have all these books that have come out, which are really going more into the mainstream culture. We have a serious dispute happening in the back end between the concept of plant intelligence, which is where we start from, which I think to a certain extent, some level of intelligence by this point has now been accepted in the sense that, yeah, plants are not dumb, they're not inert, they're not stupid. By 2022, we start to get pretty okay with the idea that plants are, doing something in some ways that is intelligent. They're able to process information in a way that shows some level of intelligence. Cognition, on the other hand, which is again where Monica Galliano really pushed towards, and several others, not just her, is still highly debatable because cognition starts to take us toward consciousness, and consciousness is still, even today in 2024, a very big hot button. So we're in the process of kind of the tail end of a whole series of articles that have gone back and forth, of articles of research studies and of all kinds of different things going back and forth, talking about plant intelligence and plant consciousness and plant communication. By this point kind of stabilizes. And we're going to start to see a whole series of papers that start to come out about plant. Why did that happen? Something dinged. And I was like, why are you dinging? You're not supposed to ding. I closed you. There's a whole series of papers that are going to start to come out that talk about plant communication in a way that's just matter of factly. Like, oh, this is how plants communicate. So that part stabilizes. But in stabilizing that, all kinds of other stuff rears its head, its scientific head, and there is kind of like, wait a minute, are we sure about this? So this is one of those types of papers, I believe, from what is happening. So we just need to kind of get into this. Let's just get into this paper and see where this paper takes us, because I am very curious as to whether or not this person's ends up kind of getting to the place of, oh yeah, plants aren't conscious or cognizant. Let's talk cognizant. Or whether or not this person is saying, no, 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 let's not even have this debate. Plants are not cognizant at all. Okay. So this is, like I said, why studying plants' cognition is valuable, even if plants aren't cognitive. And let's just, published in November of 2022. So tail end. And this is all really getting into the hypothesis around the idea that plants are cognitive beings. So, all right. Abstract. Philosophers and scientists propose the idea that plants are cognitive, which has been met with criticisms. Duh. We've read most of the papers of the criticisms. These criticisms focus on the fact that plants do not possess the properties traditionally associated with cognition. Now, these are very important. Remember how I keep telling you, you have to read somewhat between the lines, because there are some scientists in this realm that want to tell us things or want to express certain beliefs, but do not feel like they can actually express their beliefs. So what do? They bury it in these words, in their papers, in other ways, and hopes that it will shine through. So this is a great, even just this second sentence. The criticisms focus on the fact that plants do not possess the properties traditionally associated with cognition. In other words, already from the bat, we're saying plants might be cognitive, maybe, but nobody from the criticism against really going after plant cognition comes from the fact that the way we look at cognition, what we use in cognition, how we think about and talk about cognition, and more importantly, how we study and measure cognition is not the way plants do it. Therefore, are plants doing it at all? So already that sentence leaves some space open for it. By contrast, several proponents introduce novel ways to conceptualize cognition. How should we make sense of this debate? In this paper, I argue that the plant cognition debate is not about whether plants meet a set of well-delineated and agreed upon criteria according to which they count as cognitive. All right, so then what is it? Rather, many proponents are hypothesizing about cognition. They construe cognition, in all caps, mind you, not as an expression of what cognition is, but rather as a conjecture about what cognition might be. And I have to say that I completely agree with this from the perspective that we have been talking about this over and over again in so many of these papers, which is it's almost not even important whether or not yet. No, it's not that's not the right thing. Hold on, let me think about how I'm going to say this because this is not the right way I want to say it. What is really one of the most important and critical steps to take in this process of recognizing plants for the intelligent, cognizant, and potentially conscious beings that they are, is to recognize that our definitions of consciousness, cognition, and probably even intelligence are limited to the biology that we have studied historically, which is human animal. It has not been the biology of plants. And so if we were to think of the fact that cognition does not exist at all, let's assume we are in the early stages, this idea of what it could mean to be cognizant, to be aware, self-aware, to be able to have a psychological thinking mind is something that we've never heard about, know anything about. And the first being we study is plants. What would our definition of what cognition is look like? Would it be different? Because if it would be different, but we would reach the conclusion that we would eventually reach the conclusion of a type of consciousness, then our problem is not whether or not plants are consciousness, it's our very definition of consciousness at all. And that's really what is being said here. It's a conjecture about what cognition might be. In other words, it's the redefinition of what cognition is. These conjectures orient research that can uncover novel similarities amongst the phenomenon to which these concepts extend. In defending this view, I argue that investigating plant cognition is valuable, even if the results of these investigations lead us to reject the claim that plants are cognitive. And I can see this. This is something we've been asking for. We have been asking for open the door to the idea that you don't actually know what all forms of cognition are. All forms of cognition are not the forms that we have seen up until now, that there could be other forms of cognition. And therefore, plants might not fit into the cognition that we know of for humans and animals, but could fit into a completely different. And if we allow ourselves to see that, then could we in the future also recognize other forms of cognition, such as fungi cognition or cognition of bacteria or prochorus? Like, what other kinds of cognition could be out there that we have missed because we have set all our scientific definitions on the cognition of humans? Introduction. Several philosophers and scientists, oops, oh no, you're doing that thing. Hold on, I set it to the wrong mode. Sorry, I set it to the wrong mode. Okay. Several philosophers, why are you doing that? There are papers that like jump in the way that they do things, and therefore it's really annoying because you're trying to read and it jumps to something else. That's not what I wanted. All right, let's try this. No, it's not going to give it to me in the what I need. I don't know if it's the way that it's set up. I thought it was me that was picking the wrong thing, but it looks like it's not me, and it's just the way that this paper is set up. Yeah, all right, I have to just deal with it. Several philosophers and scientists propose the idea that plants are cognitive, drawing from both provocative empirical studies and novel approaches to conceptualizing cognition. And see, here we're talking about, again, look at the papers that are listed here underneath. Troavas, which we've read, Calvo Garzón in 2000, which is Paco Calvo. You'll see Calvo here and you'll see Calvo Garzón there. They're actually the same person. Francisco Calvo Garzón is the same person as Paco Calvo, is the same person as Francisco Calvo. It's all the same name. It's just that, Spaniards, Spaniards with their double last names and their like different nicknames for names. So Segundo Ortin and Calvo, we've reviewed here. So you can go back and look at that in 2019 and 2022. We have actually reviewed both of the papers that are listed here. And Kaiser, we just talked about in our last paper. These proposals, perhaps unsurprisingly, have been met with criticisms. These criticisms include the following. Plant cognition involves non-literal uses of the term cognition. Non-literal is basically a very polite way of saying non-human. Plant behavior is adequately explained in non-cognitive terms. Disagree, but this is where Adams and Garrison, who unfortunately are biologists, neurologists, I think I remember Adams, I believe, is a neurologist, and proposals of plants' cognition equivocate between cognition and mere information processing. Not true. But that's what Adams wants to propose. So we've done the reply to Adams, because Adams' paper in 2018, we did the reply to that. Oh, good reply. For these reasons and others, critics argue that plants do not bear the mark of cognitive, suggesting that proposals of plant cognition are metaphorical, or perhaps moves that make research sound more exciting than it otherwise might be perceived. This is a direct dig on Monica Galliano, I believe. That's me. That's my belief. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's a belief. It's also a dig on Calvo, Segundo Ortiz. Yeah, it could be a few different people. In this paper, I argue that plants are valuable to the study of cognition, even if it turns out that from what we learned from this study, we end up rejecting the claim that plants are cognitive. What's this footnote? I'm so curious as to the footnote. Footnote 2. I discuss whether plants are cognitive rather than whether they say possess cognition. So we read that sentence again because that's read back. I discuss whether plants are cognitive rather than whether they possess cognition, as my thesis does not commit to whether cognition is better construed as a property or an activity, which is the concept that we talked about in nervous systems. Is it a property or is it an activity? I thank an anonymous reviewer for pointing out this potential worry. Let's go back up. Despite my thesis seeming like a contradiction, I argue that investigating plant cognition is valuable because these investigations test novel concepts of cognition, allowing us to refine the content and extensions of these concepts via these tests. Investigating this broader case of cognition can supply us the evidence necessary for us to settle independent debates about what cognition is and where it can be found. My thesis reflects that this debate is not about whether plants meet well-delineated and agreed-upon criteria for cognition. Rather, several proponents are hypothesizing about cognition. I like this. We don't normally get footnotes that we can actually read. For clarity, I adopt the philosophical practice of using cognition. I love it when we put that in capitals to refer to the concept. Cognition. Oh, so capital letters. Cognition refers to the concept. Cognition in quotes to refer to the term, and cognition with no quotes and all lowercase to refer to the phenomenon itself. So now we know our markings. They construe cognition as a concept, not as an expression of what cognition is, but rather as a conjecture about what cognition might be. Although, isn't what cognition might be and what cognition is both the same because it cannot be proved either which way other than through human-made tests? This is, it's freaking Ouroboros with the snake biting its own tail. To test this conjecture, researchers compare a phenomenon in plants to paradigmic cognitive phenomenon in humans and other animals, uncovering similarities and differences between these phenomenon and the relevance of these similarities and differences for scientific aims. In Section 2, I briefly review the plant cognition debate. In Section 3, I characterize what this debate is about and address how conceptualizations of cognition have changed over time because of our growing knowledge of phenomenon in both paradigmatic and controversial cognitive systems, I propose that plant cognition is a productive research program when understood as hypothesizing about cognition. In section 4, I support my account by showing how hypothesized concepts guide new and productive empirical practices by reshaping our understanding of this debate. I recast criticisms in section 5. My assessment of plant cognition debate gives us insight into how how concepts like cognition, I can't do the air quotes because that doesn't count, cognition as a concept, inform and are informed by research. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. Okay. The plant cognition debate. While claims about plant sentience can be found throughout history, many, yes, they can, because we even reviewed something from the 1800s. Okay, 1800s. Many of the recent proposals of plant cognition stem from research on plant signaling. Electrical signaling in plants, because plant neurobiology eventually got renamed to plant behavior and signaling because nobody wanted to touch the whole term of neurobiology with a 10-foot pole. Has been investigated since at least Alexander von Humboldt, and researchers have measured plant action potentials with spike frequencies like electrical activity in animals, which is the premise of many different aspects, including the music of the plants. Since then, plant scientists have studied the mechanisms that underwrite plant signaling and their similarities to those that underwrite cognition. Based on the fruits of these findings, several researchers have adopted the controversial title of plant neurobiology. Really, from 2006 to 2022, we are still putting plant neurobiology in quotes for their nascent subdiscipline. Additionally, studies on plant intelligence putatively show plant growth and movement is not merely reflexive. Rather, it expresses learning-informed choices adapted to environmental conditions. For instance, daughters, the plant daughters, not daughters as in my daughter, but daughters as in the plant daughter, parasitic plant, putatively anticipate reward when this parasitic plant accepts or rejects hosts. Likewise, arguments for plant cognition address how postulating internal processes can help us to understand their highly sophisticated adaptive responses. In the same way, these processes explain human behavior. For instance, leaf orientation in Lavatera critica can occur without direct sunlight. This nocturnal reorientation seems to model the environment, leading proponents to argue that leaf laminas of Lavatera can not only anticipate the direction of sunrise, but also allow for this anticipatory behavior to be retained for a number of days in the absence of solar tracking. Now, this conclusion suggests that plants' behavior can be explained via cognition just as productively as many human behaviors can be explained via cognition. Now, we've read also this paper, Garcia Rodriguez and Capaco Calvo, another one of those really interesting papers to go and explore. Other examples have made waves. Peas purportedly associate stimuli. This claim is based on a study where a cue was paired with a light source, resulting in plant growth directed through a maze based on cues' positions. Tomatoes purportedly communicate, not purportedly, come on. The communication part by 2022 is pretty solid, okay? We don't have this. The claim is based on a study of tomatoes that have connections between plant roots. A pathogen was introduced to one connected member and disease resistance and defense mechanisms of other members activated. Oh, I just saw this. Who was that? I have to look at the name. Was it, I don't remember if that was Novoplansky's study. I don't remember. A pathogen was introduced to one connected member and disease resistance and defense mechanisms of other members activated. Through these members, though these members had no direct exposure to the pathogen, though these members had no direct exposure to the pathogen. Yeah, they put them in pots that were next to one another, and maybe the disease was put into one and others next door were able to show defense mechanisms, even though they weren't exposed to the pathogen itself. French beans purportedly have goal-directed behavior. This claim is based on a study of differences in plant bending movements between contexts in which there was and was not support for the plant to climb. Together, these findings suggest that plants demonstrate hallmarks of cognition. 2.1 Approaches to cognition as a concept in the debate. Proponents of plant cognition do not assert that plants possess what cognitive scientists traditionally consider to be human cognition. Rather, several research groups are dissatisfied with these existing concepts because they're limiting. And they pair the discussion of empirical findings with novel approaches to conceptualizing cognition. I review 3 approaches to the concept of cognition that are presented in tandem with the study of plant cognition. Leon's biogenic approach starts with the facts of biology as the basis for theorizing and works up to the human case by asking psychological questions as if they were biological questions, which contrasts with an anthropocentric approach, which assumes human cognition as the paradigms and works down to a more general explanatory concept, which of course does not work. It doesn't work because all beings are different and they express themselves differently. Leon posits 10 cognitive principles informed by evolutionary biology, self-organizing complex systems, and autopoieses. Hold on, I'm turning on some light for when it starts to get even darker outside because it's starting to. Okay. Leon's principles, such as cognition, relates to the more or less continuous assessment of system needs relative to prevailing circumstances. The potential for interaction and whether the current interaction is working allow for biological study of cognition. The biogenic approach does not answer what it is and what it does, questions regarding cognition. Rather, it aims to stimulate debate about the correct way to proceed to answers. I'm going to reread that because I think it's an important point. The biogenic approach does not answer what it is and what it does questions regarding cognition. It doesn't do these. It aims to stimulate debate about the correct way to proceed to answers. Another approach is basal cognition or basal cognition. It depends on who, tomato, which focuses on the phylogenetic origins of learning and goal-directed activity. This is the reason why Paco Calvo's lab is called the Minimal Intelligence Lab, because he is at a minimum trying to show basal cognition, which is first level conditioning, rather than trying to jump all the way to full-fledged all kinds of other conditioning. He's like, I'm just going to start from the base. Okay. Drawing a continuum between the humble origins of information processing and the metabolic homeostatic mechanisms of ancient cells and more complex learning, representation, and goal-directed activity. I can't decide. Which one do you like? Basal or basal? Basal. I don't know. Basal conditioning addresses the evolution of cognition in terms of metrics for anticipation, decision-making, and learning, as well as similarities between neuronal and non-neuronal organisms, which reveal an insight necessary for broadening our understanding of substrates of cognition. This approach implies that cognition is necessary for any autonomous biological system's survival, well-being, and reproduction, which supporters recognize is an uncomfortable proposition for many. At least they admit it. In response, supporters claim that whether one wishes to concede cognitions to prokaryotes, I always struggle with these words, for example, remains a matter of personal choice. And the more important question is whether proceeding as though this were the case in a biologically realistic fashion is productive. The third approach is Cobalism, which refers to the systematic way in which each living system encompasses structures, processes, and external events that maintain the fundamental metabolic processes that constitute the core of each living system. Cobalism pinpoints a cognitive toolkit through which systems are brought together and held together in a cyclic organization that as a whole systematically maintains the internal and external conditions that enable metabolic processes to continue. If an organism possesses a toolkit for maintaining the kind of cyclic organization, it should be investigated as a cognitive system. Cobalism is therefore intended to support research by fitting existing cases and suggesting new research on phenomena that have cognitive characteristics, irrespective of whether we are currently willing to call these phenomena cognitive. So these are the three different kinds of systems that we're probably going to look into. Stop it. 2.2, criticisms. Several criticisms are levied at plant cognition. Though some of these criticisms directly challenge the empirical research, I focus on three criticisms that address conceptual issues with the proposal that plants are cognitive. The first criticism is that cognition, now we have it in quotes, so we're talking about cognition as in the term, not the concept, when applied to plants does not literally mean the same thing as it does when applied to humans. Fern notes that terms like cognition apply to individuals, while proponents often apply these terms to parts of plants. And this opens up the entire subject of what is individualization or individuality within the plant world. Is the individual one what? Root system? If any leaf can become a cutting that can then grow out to be another plant, does that mean that each individual branch or potential other pieces can be? Individuality is a very complex concept, as I know from working with, little Mr. Miss McKee over here, no name Dracenia. Where am I? He concludes that plant cognition at the sub-individual level cannot mean the same thing as human cognition, extending this criticism to the biogenic approach. Adams argues that the principle above doesn't require the kind of processing of information that rises to the level of cognition, from which, and this time it's cognition as in the activity, because not the cognition as in the term, or not the cognition as in the concept. Remember, we have it written three ways. We have to keep remembering that. From which he concludes that if the term cognition is used here, it is being used to talk about something completely different from the terms used from the anthropogenic perspective. A second criticism is that the theory of cognition is not needed to explain plant behavior. Postulating internal processing is valuable when behavior cannot be explained via physical causes alone. Critics argue that these internal states represent the organism's environment as well as their reasons, intentions, and goals. Cognition adds a representational dimension to the physical causes that underwrite the system, as a complete explanation of cognitive behavior includes the representational content of the internal states. Adams and Garrison argue that the chemical mechanism within the plant that causes it to turn its leaves towards the light doesn't rise to the level of attributing reasons to the plant itself, as the causes aren't representations of the plant's goals or strategies for attaining them. In other words, the plant is not doing things for reasons, not reasons of its own, evolutionarily, which we don't know. We don't know. How do you know? In other words, evolutionary arguments also putatively debunk plants' need for cognition. Ties and colleagues argue, horrible paper. Not horrible. Okay, it was a good paper, but not good because, anyways, you got to go listen to it. There is no evidence that plants require and thus have evolved energy-expensive mental faculties to survive or to reproduce. And who says that plants are just trying to survive or reproduce? How do you not know that they're not, that kin don't do much more? Right, everyone? Right, everyone? Right? Therefore, there is no need to explain plant behavior in terms of cognition. A third criticism is that even if plants process information, mere information processing is not the mark of cognition. For instance, leaf orientation can be understood in terms of information processing, but so can motion detection by a garage door. Did they just compare a plant to a garage door? Did they? Did they? I'm trying not to be offended, but I'm failing. I'm failing. I'm failing. Cognition involves information processing, but it is processing that alters the representational format to a different level, to the level of meaning and not just information, which is true. But who's to say that plants aren't giving things meanings? Transformations of the representational vehicle, this criticism suggests, are absent from plant cognition. How do we know? I keep saying this over and over again. We have no way of testing this because you don't want to design any kinds of tests. Only one who's designing tests really that do that is Monica Galliano and a little bit of Paco Calvo. Seriously, folks, seriously. Likewise, cognition can misrepresent. I can mistakenly believe I am in the sun. By contrast, if a plant's sensors are working, its sensing of sunlight cannot be mistaken. This difference, how do we know? I want to know, how do we know? I want these scientists to have to answer the question, how do we know? The difference, without using human tests as the explanation, because a human test has no thing to be able to compare against. So why should they be able to compare plant things to human things? Tell me that. By contrast, if a plant, excuse me. By contrast, if a plant sensors, okay, sorry, that's not where I wanted to go. Oh my goodness. I told you it's been a long day. It's been a long week. There's been a lot going on. This difference, critics argue, reflects on the fact that information processing in plants does not have to be the complexity of cognition. Cognition transforms representations while losing the tight informational connection with truth that is had by sensors. Okay, this is an important piece right here and probably a complex piece to understand. And this is where really the bulk of the conversation that we're having is, okay? Cognition transforms representations while losing the tight informational connection with truth that is had by sensors. Let's use Pavlov's dog because then we can use Monica Galliano's experiment and say why Monica Galliano states that this is a representation of cognition. Now, who remembers Pavlov's dog, right? Pavlov's dog wants food, right? Pavlov's dog learns that there's every time that food is given, a little bell is rung. So Pavlov, little bell, food, animal eats, right? Dog eats. Bell, food, animal eats. Now, if before this test started, you would have rung the bell, the dog would have been like, what? Why are you not ringing a bell? What does that have to do with me? After ring bell, dog starts to salivate as if food is about to arrive. Okay? Pavlov's dog. The dog is able to transfer the definition, the sensors of food to a bell that has nothing to do with food, showing a form of cognition. Monica Galliano's experiment, you have light and you have a fan. So every time the light is associated with the fan as if they're the same thing. Same thing as the bell and the food. So eventually, fan replaces light. So what happens? Plant grows towards that fan, which means plant has now transferred, the tight information connection with truth. That is the sensor saying, this is light, which is healthy for me and it feeds me, equivalent of food, with this is a fan, and I have now think that the fan could be my food, although it's not. Explain to me why this is not valid. It's not valid. How and why we conceptualize cognition. Okay, this is 3, because we've already established that most neurologists do not want to accept Monica Galliano's experiments for that reason. Now, there is some argument to be said that Monica's statistical analysis was based on plant behaviors, which is different than animal behaviors, and therefore you calculate it even differently. And this is really where the point of contention is. And the fact that we don't speak about that as being the point of contention is quite frustrating. Because if we were to speak to that as the point of contention, I think a lot of these arguments would be very different. We would just be able to have an argument on the real point of contention, which is that you don't believe that these studies work because the way that she analyzed the study, in your opinion, was not correct. Nobody's talking about that. Let's talk about that, but nobody talks about that. The disagreement between proponents and critics makes salient a difference in outlook in the plant cognition debate. Proponents highlight that their approaches might facilitate productive scientific research and make sense of novel phenomenon, something new. Critics seem to assume a concept, if not a full theory, of cognition, as in the activity of cognition, which they show plants do not meet. The differences between proponents and critics' responses raises a question. How should we understand this debate? 3.1, what the debate is about. Let's find out what this person thinks the debate is actually about. The approaches to cognition, the theory, presented by proponents show that the plant cognition debate should not be understood as one about whether plants meet well delineated and agreed upon criteria that counts an organism as cognitive. In other words, interlocutors in this debate should not share commitments about the mark of cognitive. Rather, whether plants are cognitive is linked to a debate about what cognition is. In other words, what actually is the activity of cognition taken out of the concept of human-specific cognition? Big old question mark that we don't have. This debate exemplifies the fact that how we conceptualize cognition is not inert. Akagi notes, the norms for using the concept cognition have changed since the cognition revolution. For instance, cognitive scientists have used cognition, as in the term cognition, more inclusively over the years, providing a defense to the idea that the concept of cognition no longer extends only to highfalutin. Literally, I have never seen a scientific paper that says the word highfalutin in it. Highfalutin rational thought, but also to effective psychology and motor control. Though this idea is controversial, not only has cognition, the concept, debatedly changed, but these changes are motivated in substantial part by efforts to respond to evidence. One source of evidence is broader cases of cognition, including plant cognition. In other words, one whole set of critics do not want to use the current definition of cognition because the current definitions of cognition are connected to human definitions of cognition. But there's an acknowledgement that the definition of cognition in and of itself is changing because we are thinking of cognition differently, thanks to the fact that we've had to think about plant cognition. Regardless of whether or not you actually agree on plant cognition, the concept of thinking about whether plant cognition exists at all, changes the way you think about cognition and starts to relinquish the human hold on cognition in order for you to be able to correctly debate or more or less test what cognition is. Hopefully that makes sense. One source of evidence is border cases of cognition, including plant cognition. Why are you doing this? Sorry, my computer keeps popping shit up and it's bothering the hell out of me, and I need to fix that. Anyway, okay, sorry. One source of evidence is border cases of cognition, including plant cognition. As Akagi argues, debates like plant cognition are about how scientists should understand and ascribe the concept cognition. If evidence can motivate a change in how we conceptualize cognition, how should we proceed? Answers to this question are present in the literature. Allen proposes working definitions of cognition that are suitable for orienting newcomers to phenomenon of potential interest. Instead of focusing solely on what concepts we might formulate following the study of these phenomenon, Akagi proposes an ecumenical characterization, which categorizes phenomenon not only as cognitive or non-cognitive, but as phenomenon that are generally agreed to be cognitive, and phenomenon that engender disagreement. This characterization reflects the debate instead of picking sides in it. Kaiser suggests a world to concept fit with his Kabbalism, where a systems organization is dominant and the concept must be adapted to accommodate the features of the investigated organization. So in other words, you have to adapt your test to the organization or organism in which you are testing in that moment. Thus, a world to concept fit provides a testing ground for these concepts, often leading to conceptual changes. By testing cognition, researchers can inform this concept's content and its extension. These answers show that a concept of cognition may be proposed for reasons that are not in efforts to express what cognition is. The concept of cognition may be proposed for reasons that are not in effort to express what cognition is. Okay? So we can talk about the concept without talking about whether or not a specific thing that the concept is modifying is actually cognitive. Rather, cognition can orient research by demarcating phenomenon whose properties inform how we should conceptualize them. I argue that proponents of plant cognition, specifically those who propose the approaches in sections 2.1, are hypothesizing about cognition, not really about plants. So 3.2, hypothesizing about cognition. At its core, a hypothesis is a content-bearing conjecture. In virtue of its content, it extends to some set of phenomenon, the measures of which serve as data that confirm or disconfirm it. Hypothesis testing involves collecting these data and confirming or disconfirming this hypothesis. I didn't even know disconfirming was a word. Disconfirming. Following which it may be accepted, modified, or rejected. While we tend to think of hypotheses as scientific claims, or perhaps something else with representational content like a model, the same idea can be applied to other content-bearing items. This idea builds on extends my earlier work, in which I address circumstances in which definitions are hypotheses. Rather than these definitions expressing researchers' commitment, the content of the definition orients researchers to its test, and researchers adopt it because its content demarcates phenomenon on which they test, allowing researchers to investigate phenomenon to which the definition applies, which they may do if it did not apply to these phenomena. My account of definitions as hypotheses captures the idea that proposing definitions does not automatically entail that the proposer's stance towards this definition is one of expression. Instead, the proposer can be making a conjecture. When making a conjecture, there is no commitment that the claim or the content-bearing item is correct. Rather, the aim is to test the conjecture against data and determine whether the epistemic attitude we ought to adopt to its content. To adopt the stance towards a content-bearing item, like a definition, or, as I argue, a concept, is to hypothesize about the item in question. Thus, to hypothesize about cognition is to put forward a concept of cognition as a conjecture. Hold on a second. Give me a second. Permit me a second is, I guess, a better question of something. I want to see, where are we? Okay, my account. This is page 8 of 18, 9, 10. I want to see where. I wanna see where this actually truly ends. Okay, so this conclusion is on 16. I'm gonna tell you why I'm looking at this in this way. So hold on, let me change this view for a second. This is one of those papers. I know I'm stopping in kind of in the middle of it. I don't even remember. I have to find where we are. Um, Here's the thing about this. This is such a philosophical paper. And I will say that most likely there is a very good reason why this paper exists. In the world of cognition, the idea of arguing the concept of cognition, the word cognition, and the activity that is cognitive cognition is probably extremely valuable. Really, really is. Really is. And I have to say that if it wasn't the week of the commemoration of the dead ritual here, if it wasn't a week where I have students here, if it wasn't a week where I have seen so many world catastrophes happening and extremely heavy discussions happening, if it wasn't a week where I have yet another ritual of the ashes, which for Dom and her is our kind of equivalent of it's our ritual funeral of another dear friend and knight, I probably would be really into this paper. Even though some kind of circular philosophical arguments become too much for me sometimes, even because it's like, seriously, folks, I guess this to me is the kind of thing that is exciting and interesting if you're having a conversation with somebody, but reading it can get kind of dull. But more than anything, I don't know. I don't know. Look, folks, I'm going to be really honest. You might have seen some of my posts on social media. Um, I'm mentally tired right now. There's so much going on. Good stuff, lots of it. Heavy, heavy, life altering stuff on the other hand. Um, Flash floods all over the place. I personally, and I'm sure that many of you have had experiences, so this is to in solidarity with everybody's experiences, and your experiences are just as valid as my experiences, and I am not taking away any of your experiences right now. I have talked about, the last two hurricanes that went through the United States. One was kind of destined for Florida and then sort of did its deviation or whatever. And the second one hit Florida directly. Luckily, my family is in Southern Florida, so we didn't have any direct damage, but definitely hit people that I care about who are still dealing with the aftermaths. And while all of them luckily are beautifully safe, the devastation between that and, everything else that happened in the other hurricane, which also affects other people that I care about. Okay. Then you may have heard all the flooding that is happening in Italy. May have heard France as well. But in Italy, it's happening very close, 45 minutes to one of my very close friends' homes. So I kind of keeping tabs on her. How is she? Is it close? She can come up here if she needs to because we're about 3 hours north and we're in a mountainside. I just saw today a car accident where a car flipped. Like I said, tomorrow I have to go to this ritual. Yeah, look, there's a lot. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. And we're doing our best in the naturally conscious community to have a space where people can have conversations about these types of things, where we just don't feel alone, and more than anything, because um, when you're thinking about when we're thinking about many of these environmental pieces, this isn't going to stop. It's not going to stop. It's not going to stop. And so in the naturally conscious community, which is our online community for, human plant relations, a big piece of what we have been doing in the community since the community started has been to have discussions on what are preventable, what are the changes that we as human beings have to make from the perspective of prevention or cessation of destruction or whatever way you want to look at it. And another piece is, where do I have to adapt because the world is changing and I have to adapt to the change? What does it look like for me to adapt to constantly changing conditions? What does that look like? And I don't know always. None of us know always. So I'm incredibly grateful for having the naturally conscious community as a place where we can have these discussions, where we can talk about what's happening, where we could be honest with ourselves about our fears, but also about our anger, about what's going on, where we can have and bring our plant friends, our plant kin, our guides, and our collaborators into the conversation. I've been spending tons of time just sitting around with plants, having sometimes just being, sitting in that presence and allowing that ecosystem thinking, regardless of whether or not this paper that we're looking at allows me to say that plants think. I choose, in the context of what I'm talking about right now, to talk about plant thinking. When we're talking about a paper, I can look at all sides of the paper. Well, kind of. I still don't ascribe to the idea that plants have no consciousness at all or no cognition at all. I struggle with that, but at least I can have a conversation about it. But in this context, I choose consciously to believe in the ecosystem thinking of plants, to sit and receive that wisdom, to debate how I, as a human being with a very different structure, with a very different way of being, should connect or should change my life in order to be more naturally adaptive. This is a big part of my day. I mean, I have to be honest. I spend enormous amount of time with plants talking specifically about these things, where these papers help me understand the structure of plants. All of these papers help me better understand what does cognition even mean, and it helps me interact with plants in a different way. But ultimately, what's most important to me is, am I spending time with plants to learn how to be a better human? Am I looking at my entire world through only a human lens, which has its massive limitations because of my cognitive biases, because of my conditioning, because of all the rules and morality and stuff that I have been taught? Or am I allowing myself to bring in what is happening and let it flow through my body, as painful as that can be sometimes, and then making choices, taking action, or staying still based on the enhanced and shared interspecies. I don't want to say, what's the right word? Processing? Am I allowing my senses to expand beyond what my human limitations are in order to bring in something that's different, in order to allow myself to experience the world as a part of the world, as a being of nature, so that I can better understand. And this goes a lot to this paper in some ways. I mean, I know I stopped because it's round robin. For the longest time, it's going to be round robin. They're talking about how the hypothesizing about cognition and looking at it from a plant's perspective allows us to rethink everything, which is pretty much what I've been saying, which is we are looking at our world through one lens only, through only the limited set of senses, five main ones that we allow ourselves to experience. And even those of us that believe in beyond, when push comes to shove and we get into the tough times, we oftentimes don't rely on all that extra goodness we have been working with for so long. We don't rely on our expanded senses, on our inner plantness, on our multi-passionate selves. We start to, in the fear of it, break everything down, hone in, become more and more myopic in it. And it doesn't work. It's not good for us. It's not the best answer. It's not the best direction. It's not going to take us to new solutions or new adaptations. Because if you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. So now is a time more than anything to lean in to your alternative self. And you need a place where you can do that, where you can explore that. That's why the naturally conscious community exists, right? To be able to have that safe space to explore, to be able to have those events that push us and allow us and gives us opportunities to explore. The writing group and our creative greenhouses and the mini voyages with the spirit wild plants, like all of these different things are plant inspired masterclasses, reconnect with the plant kingdom itself. Like all of this events and knowledge and wisdom is not to say this is fact, but is to say, test out your theories, become more than human yourself, allow yourself to be more than human, explore the world in a whole new way and see where it takes you. Can it take us to an adaptation? Will we evolve into another species? Can we be more than we are today? And more importantly, will that lead us to more naturally conscious lives where I feel integrated into the world around me? I don't know where I'm going with this rant, to be honest. It's not really a rant. I don't know what it is. I'm still looking at the paper saying, is there any place to pick up? Do we want to pick up? Because it just feels like this is a person who's somewhat agreeing with us because he's pushing for us to think outside the box and then to let that reshape the box. And that's positive, right? That's what we want. This is exactly what we are looking for. But then you get stuff like that. There's no benefit to doing this. And it's so ridiculously frustrating. So ridiculously frustrating. How can you tell me that there's no benefit in doing this? So only to see if some novel ways of looking at this might come up. Maybe something interesting might come up to help us better understand human cognition, not plants. So I don't know. Let me see. I'm going to get to the conclusion because a lot of these are all the different papers that we've all studied here together. Hold on. I'm trying to get to a place where it makes sense for us to re-pick up this. I wanna find a place. Okay, let's just pick it up here and see if it makes sense. If not, I'll go a little bit farther back because I think this might work. Okay. Recasting the criticism of plant cognition. How does my account of hypothesizing about plant cognition address the criticisms I present in section 2? Here I recast those criticisms. So basically, kind of just hold on because I very quickly skimmed it. Basically, what he went through and did, all these papers that we've reviewed, Monica Galliano's research, Balushka and Mancuso's research on anesthetics, Monica Galliano talking about habituation, memory, as well as cognition, Paco Calvo and his pea plants and circumnavigation, yeah, and his other philosophy papers that we've read through, not the extension of nervous system. Nobody talked about that. I just brought that up and that doesn't mean anything. All of these other papers, he goes through them one by one and talks about how, regardless of whether or not you believe it's their findings, the novel approach used by those papers to study plants helps us better understand and rethink the definitions of cognition. That is a synthesis. He goes through them one by one. He details them in detail, but in essence, what he's saying is really that, okay? He's saying that this perspective improves or helps us better think about the term cognition, the one with quotes, and the concept of cognition, even if individually, none of them really spell out what cognition is. So he talks. So now I can go back to the paper. Here I recast the criticisms. Remember, we read the criticisms at the very beginning. My responses do not entail that the heart of the criticisms is fundamentally flawed. You might not say that, but some of us might. No, I don't know. Actually, that's not true. That's not true. Meanie. Okay. Rather, their target and way in the plant cognition debate must be reconsidered because of how proponents construe the theory of cognition. Thus, my responses are not intended to settle the debate. They are intended instead to keep proponents and critics in this debate from speaking past one another, which is a noble cause. What will settle the debate, I argue, are empirical studies like the examples I addressed in section 4, which are all the studies that I already talked about. The first criticism is that cognition, the term, when applied to plants, is literally not the same meaning as it is when it's applied to humans. This criticism presupposes that uses of the term cognition are intended to express what cognition is. However, this presupposition does not consider the difference between expression and conjecture. Plant cognition proponents use the term cognition literally, but their use of this term is a conjecture about cognition instead of an expression of the commitments about cognition. In other words, as of this date, because of the lack of empirical data, we are using the term cognition to refer to what we think cognition will look like in plants, not instead an expression of the finalized, proven theories of plant cognition. That's the first recasting. The fact that proponents literally mean something unlike what critics mean when they use cognition is a feature of this debate, because proponents hypothesize about cognition in the light of their dissatisfaction with traditional variants of this concept. The use of the same term with different meanings is not a problem for understanding the debates between proponents and critics. Rather, it is a consequence of treating different concepts of cognition, which are the basis of these unlike uses, as rival hypotheses. While the critic can argue that one of these rivals is better supported by existing or forthcoming evidence, the mere fact that the interlocutors in this debate do not literally mean the same thing when they use the term cognition is not in itself a criticism of the positions put forward by proponents. There is merit to debating which use of the term is best, but critics should not assume that all interlocutors want to use cognition to refer to what they have in mind when critics use a term, even when applied to humans. The second criticism is that cognition is not needed to explain plant behavior. This criticism presupposes the explanans and the explanandum, the explanans and the explanandum of cognition. For the former, these criticisms assume that the cognition explains behavior via a computational framework, such as the framework inherited by cognitive science from computer science. By contrast, the three approaches I mentioned show mixed evaluation of cognition in terms of computation. Basal cognition does not involve computational explanation, but the biogenic approach and the cobalism appear to be more amenable to non-representational dynamical explanations. Further, hypothesizing about cognition does not take as its aim the explanation of phenomenon. Instead, its aim is to uncover similarities, including similarities related to the explanatory underpinnings of phenomena that count as a cognition according to one of these concepts. This fact means that critics should not be surprised that proponents of cognition do not explain. This is not the purpose of their concepts. It is the aim to achieve by testing them. Perhaps the critic will stand by the idea that the physical causes alone explain plant behavior, so there is no need to postulate anything above these causes, regardless of what cognition is taken to be. The potential response relates to the assumption about what proponents want to explain. For cases like adaptive behavior within an organism's lifetime, based on what appears to be the retention and recall of information from the past, it is far from clear that researchers would not benefit from the postulation of internal states or dynamical processes akin to those put forward in debates about human cognition. This criticism is not without its merit if taken as an assessment of whether any plant behavioral phenomenon really has these properties. But the mere assertion that plants do not exhibit these kinds of behaviors without an investigation of these phenomenon is an unwarranted, preemptive assumption of the research. I want to highlight that line, because that's exactly what human neurobiologists do all the freaking time. It can't be. How do you know? How do you know? What cognition is and what phenomena count as cognitive are up for debate. And the value of hypothesizing what cognition lies in part in the uncovering of novel phenomenon in plants and other organisms. The third criticism is that even if plants process information processing is not the mark of the cognitive. I agree that information processing likely is not the mark of the cognitive, given that this formalism and conceptual schema can be used to account for most systems depending on how liberally one applies it. However, because, that goes to the garage door. That's an information processing, right? A light comes on, the garage door light, then recognizes or a signal comes in and then the garage door opens. That is information processing, but is it cognizant? No, because it's programmed in. However, this criticism presupposes what over and above information processing counts as cognition. None of the three hypothesized concepts I have discussed have bare information processing as their content. Likewise, only one of these hypothesized concepts, basal cognition, appeals to representationality. So much of this is translated and probably kind of almost Google or DeepL translated without having a native speaker. Anyway, it takes a lot to edit and something written in another language. Trust me, I do it all the time. So merely arguing that plant information processing does not involve the transformations of representations is insufficient for arguing that they are not cognitive. The debate is over what cognition is, so a critic of plant cognition should not assume a particular representational account as the basis for their criticisms, unless they want to beg the question. One aspect of this criticism that has merit is the concern about misrepresentation and its alleged non-occurrence in plants. Cashing out this concern in terms of representation is not ideal, given disagreements over representationality that I addressed in the last paragraph. Nonetheless, the idea that cognitive processing involves predictable kinds of errors is one type of phenomenon for which proponents must find similarities in plants. The criticism can be understood in terms of hypothesizing about cognition. If researchers cannot discover a novel phenomenon in plants that share properties with this type of phenomenon in humans, its relevance for characterizing and explaining human behavior might lead to the disconfirmation. Somebody confirm whether or not disconfirmation exists as a word of novel concepts of cognition. Thus, this criticism can be recast as a challenge to plant cognition proponents. Find similarities between plant phenomenon and this type of phenomenon in humans. If these similarities are not uncovered, then the concepts should be modified or abandoned. My reappraisals of these criticisms do not dismiss the concern that lie at the heart of them. Rather, they are best understood when recast as challenges to the empirical findings when one hypothesizes about cognition. This fact supports my claim that investigating plant cognition is valuable, even if it turns out that plants are not cognitive. Let the proponents test their concepts by doing research on novel phenomena in plants and attempting to uncover similarities between these phenomena and those associated with cognition in humans and other animals. At best, they might revolutionize our understanding of cognition. At worst, the evidence they acquire will provide a better impression of the distinctiveness of cognition from other capacities of biological systems. Which I agree with. I mean, this paper, the reason I didn't go through all of it is because a lot of it is circular because we agree with it. There's a lot here to be agreed upon. We do want you to test. We want you to not categorically say it's not possible because humans do it and therefore plants can't. We want you to allow the testing to show itself, whatever it might show. Some of us already know what it's going to show. Hey, I've never claimed to not be biased in this. I just want it on the record. Okay. In this paper, I have addressed why investigating plant cognition is valuable, even if plants are not cognitive. I hate just the way that they say it. Even if it turns out plants are not cognitive. I think that that's the better way of saying it. In explaining that my thesis is not a contradiction, I argue that several proponents of plant cognition introduce novel approaches to cognition. These approaches are best construed as conjectures, which orient empirical research to test these concepts. This idea, which I call hypothesizing about cognition, is valuable because the research needed to confirm or disconfirm these concepts will supply us the evidence of similarities and differences between the set of phenomena to which the concepts extend. As it stands, whether cognition is a natural kind, let alone what the mark of cognitive is an ongoing debate in cognitive science. I recommend that critics do not assume that these issues are resolved, though there is much to remain critical of when researchers hypothesize about cognition. Understanding how proponents test these concepts is what is needed for us to assess them. And given the nature of hypothesis testing, the research these proponents do might vindicate critics' position. Might not. Thus, even if one is not particularly optimistic about the future of plant cognition research, I include myself in this group. Ooh, rude. The best reason for accepting or rejecting the position that plants are cognitive will be found by hypothesizing about cognition. True, exactly. But rude that, he says it that way. Okay. We made it. We made it to the end. I know I skipped a big chunk in the middle, but because, like I told you, I summed it up for you in 3 words because we've read all these papers already. We know what all this research looks like. So we know what it is. So ultimately, let's summarize this in a second. Oops. Let me summarize this. So let's summarize this by going back to the top. So here what we're talking about is why studying plant cognition is valuable, even if plants aren't cognitive. Let's rephrase this. Why studying plants cognition is valuable, even if it turns out plants aren't cognitive. That's really what David Colaço or whatever is trying to say. So David Colaço is basically saying, in very simple terms, he's saying, regardless of whether or not you today believe that it is possible that plants are cognitive, the idea of studying plant cognition is important because it will either prove that plants are cognitive or because of the way that the novelty is needed in order to test these hypotheses for plants. In other words, because we need to think of new and unusual ways of applying the cognition that we think of as humans to plants or trying to read or understand, it is only going to improve human cognition and cognitive understanding by doing these experiments, because these experiments will expand the definitions that we use for cognition in general, which can then be applied back to humans in some way, shape, or form. In other words, It's a win-win situation. Regardless of whether or not plants end up being seen as cognitive, which unfortunately the author doesn't believe is possible, but this one here does, and you know that it does. Regardless of whether or not which this type of research shows one thing or another, doesn't matter. The important part is that we do this research because in doing this research, we will learn new things that can help the overall understanding of cognition. Boom. That's it. This whole paper, this whole thesis is all to say that. That's it. What do you think? Interesting? Not interesting? I want to hear. I want to hear from you. So we've been doing these plant consciousness commentary for a long time. I love doing them. I love sharing these papers with you. I'd love to hear what you think about this. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Is it worth it? Are you getting through it? Is it too confusing? Is it too hard? Is it not really like, or is it something you love? Tell me. I want to hear it. So I want to hear it all. Share your comments. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for supporting my ranty rant or my soliloquy in the middle, because it's a time. It's a time. There's a lot going on right now. And yeah, there's a lot going on. If you want to be a part of conversations like this, if you want to get into your own experiences with plants in a new way, if you really want to talk to more people who are exploring what does it mean for me to live as a being of nature, then please come in and join us in the Naturally Conscious community. This is where all these conversations are happening. It's pretty simple. naturallyconsciouscommunity.com. That's where we are. That's where we're going to be. And I think that's everything. I think today I should probably just close it right here. I mean, it's a day. It's a day. So thank you so much for being here with me. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your thoughts and ideas. And if you're struggling right now, if this is a hard time for you too, please take the time for self-care. There's nothing selfish in self-care. And if I can help you in any which way to process what you're going through, please reach out to me. I'm super easy to find. You see my name, just type it into Google. You will find all kinds of things. And join us in the Naturally Conscious community, because that is the place to have those kinds of conversations. No judgment, just a safe space for human-plant relations and for expansion with other kin. So that being said, remember, resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. This is me, Tigira Gardenia. I'm out. Bye.